Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you might be. I am Safwan Masri, Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development at Columbia University. Today's webinar is part of our book series In Conversation With, a joint production with our partner, Columbia University Press. The series gives our global audience an opportunity to listen to and engage with scholars and academics offering a variety of perspectives as they discuss their latest books. Our partner, Columbia University Press, was founded in 1893, and it is one of America's oldest university presses. It publishes, translates, and distributes books in an array of disciplines and professional programs. The global centers are Columbia's physical and intellectual infrastructure in the world, facilitating and curating research and education programs that connect us with local partners and serve to advance the creation and exchange of knowledge globally. We are in 9 permanent locations around the world, and during the pandemic, we have created an additional 9 pop-up global centers and provided our international students in over 90 cities with study and community spaces around the world. Now, back to why we are assembled here today. We are here to discuss an important book and to engage in what promises to be a fascinating conversation. World as Family, A Journey of Multi-Rooted Belongings was written by Vishakha Desai. I'd like to introduce my friend Vishakha to you by sharing an excerpt that particularly resonated with me. She writes, in a world of instantaneous connections and deep fissures across borders, pandemics and climate crises that know no borders, and millions on the move, one could argue that we have no choice but to expand our sense of belonging to include the whole human race. The global phenomena of coronavirus and cries for social justice over the past year demand that we learn to navigate the interconnected complexities of the world at local, national, and global levels. But how do we do that against the backdrop of anti-global noise from many corners of society? For me, it has been the journey of a lifetime, end quote. This seems to be the most important question of our era. How do we do what must be done in a climate hostile to change or clouded by visions of how life used to be? The very concept of being able to redefine family is anathema to some people, implying a break with the fundamental tenets upholding their lives. The journalist Sidney J. Harris's quip that everyone wants things to stay the same while getting better informs us that radical change is always a hard sell. It gets framed as an agenda, then politicized and polarized. But incremental progress accomplished through personal connections can profoundly change our worlds. In many ways, that is the function that literature has filled, or human interest stories. They offer non-prescriptive tales of growth and intertwined humanity. This is the genius that Vishakha Desai has brought to her current work and to her introspective journey, which I am pleased to say currently has Dr. Vishakha Desai here at Columbia, where she is Senior Advisor for Global Affairs to President Bollinger, Chair of the Committee on Global Thought, and Senior Research Scholar in Global Studies at the School of International Public Affairs. Prior to joining Columbia, Vishakha served for 8 years as President and CEO of the Asian Society. Her tenure at the Asian Society was preceded by a position at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where from 1990 to 2004, Dr. Desai was curator for Indian and Southeast Asian art and head of public programs and academic affairs. Her advanced degrees, both in Asian art history, are from the University of Michigan. Our discussion will be moderated by Irina Bokova, a Bulgarian diplomat, politician, and for 9 years, ending in 2017, the first woman to hold the position of Director General of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO. Bokova had served as Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ambassador of Bulgaria to France, Monaco, and UNESCO, and she was Secretary of the Council of Ministers for European Integration. Welcome, Irina. Welcome, Vishakha. Irina, I turn it to you to start the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Safwan, for this presentation. Let me say that I'm indeed delighted to be here with my dear friend Vishakha, a prominent scholar, a great friend, and I would say a great thinker when it comes to global affairs, when it comes to culture, when it comes to heritage, and when it comes to the very important conversation nowadays about globalism and about identity. I was accompanying a little bit Vishakha Desai because she was kind enough, she had trust in me to share some of the drafts of this wonderful book, Treat the World as a Family, and promoting new approaches, as you rightfully said, to thinking and acting locally, nationally, transnationally. I was thinking a lot when reading this book, where actually Vishakha takes the initial strength and initial ideas to launch this thinking about identity, about belonging. And it came to my mind because during my last year at UNESCO, I had the privilege of going to her city, the city where she was born, Ahmedabad, and to present the certificate of the inscription of the historic city of Ahmedabad into the UNESCO World Heritage. Actually, it was the first historic city in India to be inscribed on the World Heritage list. There were many monuments, but the first city. And I was, of course, I visited the Sabarmati Ashram, the very modest, humble residence of Mahatma Gandhi. We all know that Ahmedabad is very much linked with the Mahatma Gandhi's thinking, and it's the political, cultural city, actually, of Gandhi. And what is very interesting to mention here, and I would just invite Vishakha probably to start her comments with this, I looked once again at why this historic city was inscribed, apart from all the wonderful temples and monuments that were there. But one thing struck me very much. It was the city planning, which is an hierarchy of living environment, and the streets that create a community spaces. It was this sense of strong community bondage. And I think Vishakha explains this wonderfully in her book. But this was also recognized by the World Heritage Committee as one of the reasons for inscribing Ahmedabad. So this community bondage was very much present in Vishakha's book. So Vishakha, please tell us what made you, in fact, write this book.
Well, first of all, Safwan, thank you, my dear, dear friend, to be part of this program. And Irina, my goodness, how honored I am to have you, because our relationship and friendship goes back more than a decade when we first had the opportunity where I interviewed you at the Asian Society. So thank you. And I think that how right you are to begin with Ahmedabad, because in a way, that's where my life begins. Even though I was born in Surat, my parents were very much a part of this city, the city of Gandhi. And I think that what you're really getting at is that Ahmedabad has this ancient heritage that's actually part of its Muslim heritage. At the same time, it has Jain temples, it has other areas, and it has contemporary architecture if you go right outside. So the city is as much about tradition and modernity that come together because essentially the post-independent India, my life, I was born right after independence, was really about this notion of capaciousness of India and Indianness. And that's where I got from my parents, who were both Gandhian freedom fighters. My father used to laugh and say that he really was grateful to be imprisoned by the British, because in a way that gave him time away from his activities to read and write and think about what it meant to be Indian and to question what it meant to be Indian. So I think that in a way, what I always think about, and I write about it in the book, is that the earlier spirit of independent India, especially with the Gandhian mentality, was that how to have your foundation strong in your house, but open your windows, open the doors for other cultures to come in. So that idea of openness and strength within a culture was something that I felt I was privileged to have, both in the school that I went to, which was also a Gandhian school, not an English medium colonial era school, but with the choice that actually we would learn our own language, our own culture, and learn English well. So it was a completely different kind of a mentality, and not being in a Mumbai or Delhi in sort of very cosmopolitan background, it allowed me to understand that roots are important. But roots that open up to the world are equally important. Hence the image of a banyan tree that I talk about in the book, that where the roots become branches and branches become roots, and yet they're responding to the wind and sun on the outside. So that idea was inherent in our upbringing in Ahmedabad. And I feel very privileged to have had that experience.
It's indeed wonderful what you said, because I was also about to mention the wonderful opening about the banyan tree. And this metaphor that you use, I think it's very relevant to many similar circumstances. You speak about having roots, and I think when we were working with you and globally in order to evaluate, to present, to respect different cultures, tangible, intangible heritage, and all the rest. I think it is important that everyone in this global village knows about his or her own culture, respects it, understands it, proud of it, but not being closed into it, open. I think this message of yours is extremely important. Even I think if you know better your culture, you're more confident, and you can also respect the other cultures. And your, I think, approach is very important. This is the fundamental, as you said, quite apparent dichotomy between this type of openness, of global engagement, and of course, to have these roots to be locally engaged. How do you see this?
It's so perfect that you mentioned that, because I think that oftentimes, especially in the current moment when we think about culture, there is huge amount of questions about decolonization, about who gets to write about what, who has a right to show what in a museum. In my 40 plus year of career in the museum world, I actually started out A, as a political science major, not unlike you, B, then actually going as a dancer and trained as a dancer. So I want to kind of go back to that beginning where I began to think about arts and culture in a different way. I also feel very privileged that my father was passionate about heritage. So, you know, when you talked about Ahmedabad being called the heritage city, I know if he were alive, he would be just front and center, because he was in the planning commission to start with the archaeological monuments and to actually get money for the archaeological survey in the Gujarat Circle to get Dholavira, the first very ancient pre-Indus Valley site, to get recognized as an important site. So I kind of grew up with all of this, but it was not until I went to Cleveland Museum of Art where somebody saw me doing classical Indian dance. And it was the curator of education at the Cleveland Museum. And it so happened that Cleveland had one of the largest collection and finest collection of Asian art. I didn't know that, but there it was. And I started working with East Cleveland Public School kids from 5th grade. These were African-American kids from one of the least advantaged neighborhood of Cleveland. And Cleveland Museum had this program where they would come to me for 6 weeks, 1 week at a time, and actually start talking about how to educate and work with them in the museum setting. I was 21 years old. I didn't know anything. And I talk about this kind of first example, and I wore my Indian best. I thought they would know that I was from somewhere else. Of course, they had no clue. When I said I was Indian, they immediately thought it was Hopi or Navajo or one of those Indians, you know. And so then we went through this thing, and then one of the wonderful young kid, a woman, a young girl who says, gee, but that if Columbus made a mistake, because I explained to them how that name came to be, said, he made a mistake so long ago. Why are we still calling them that? And I said, it beats me, because this was before Native American was used as a term. So often people would say I was East Indian, but they were the real Indian. And I just never understood that that was the case, you know. So the long story short, here they were, they didn't even know where India was. And within 6 weeks, we started doing dances in the galleries with a Shiva Nataraja that was an amazing sculpture. And at the end of this 6-week program, they were running around in the galleries like they were their friends. They were talking to me like I was their friend. And I understood the power of art to actually be of a place long time ago and transcend time and geography, time and space. It's that capacity of art, as you talked about, and culture, but especially the arts, that actually can be both about a particular moment, but then they have a whole life beyond that moment, and you can connect with them at another point. And as a result, I felt like this is a perfect metaphor for being in the world, to have the specific history and connect beyond. Today, people are really concerned because they feel that the museums are becoming status of only a particular kind of power and colonization. I completely get that. All of that is very important. But if we try to box art in only one box, whether it's a universal box or a culturally specific box, we lose the specialty of art. And I know that when you were at UNESCO, that's one of the tension, right? Who gets to have what kind of art? How do you make historical wrongs and make them right, but without losing the universal power of art? So I'd actually like to ask you how you navigated those worlds, because sometimes there are very powerful arguments on both sides of the story. So what the conversations were like for you at UNESCO to balance those two?
Maybe, Irina, as you answered that question, one of the things I'm taking, from what Vishakha is saying that's making me think is that, art belongs to all of humanity, right? So that's one. And I'm sure this is something you've had to deal with a lot and battle at UNESCO. But I'm also hearing from Vishakha is that, and all three of us, by the way, fit into Vishakha's narrative in that, we have multi-rooted belongings. And I think, what makes you sort of more of a globalist is your ability to bring your culture that you grew up with, in your case, Vishakha in India, with you, and then adopt cultural values also from your adopted home. And that gives you sort of liberty and freedom then that allows you to navigate different cultures around the world very easily. So maybe, Irina, you can, integrate sort of those aspects of it, the particular, the peculiar, and the local sort of elements of art, but also the universality of it and its ownership, so to speak.
I think, Vishakha, you said it beautifully, what art represents today and what it brings to the world, to humanity, when it transcends history, different periods. And it is not specifically place-based. And I think this is an important message also of your book. And what you, Safwan, also asked me, I think what is very much important to understand is that art and culture nowadays in the world are understood as a global public good. It does not relate only to one particular circumstance, to one period, to one culture. I think we have broadened extremely. We have opened our minds to a very different understanding about culture. And we have embraced all different expressions, cultural expressions nowadays. Of course, we have a heritage, cultural, movable, immovable heritage. We have intangible heritage, which is also very important. And Vishakha mentioned just a while ago the way she also introduced her own identity culture to the Cleveland Museum through the dance. By the way, in the book, there are beautiful photos. Thank you, Vishakha, for putting these beautiful photos of yours as a dancer, which are amazing indeed. And at the same time, we speak about expressions of cultural diversity nowadays. So I think we really have broadened the understanding of what culture means. And if you look at coming back to what happens nowadays in the world with the global pandemic. Oh, this is the beautiful photos indeed. Thank you for I was amazed indeed of looking at that. I was looking for them in the book. I thought you did not put them, but I found them. And I think it is important to see nowadays with the pandemic, global pandemic, I think we started anew to appreciate culture and what it brings to all of us. Because of the consequences of the pandemic, because of the need of all of us once again to relate to each other. And I think it is through culture that we relate to each other. And it is also through the expressions of creativity that is so much needed nowadays. The other side of this problem, of course, and this is something that at UNESCO and globally sometimes you have to deal with, it is the competition, which I don't want to call it this way, but what we all wanted and what Vishakha did also with the Asia Society is to give the opportunity to all these different cultures to be appreciated, to be known. But it is not a beauty contest. It is not a competition. It is really where we all are. And just before I pass the floor to Vishakha, let me, Vishakha, a quote from your book, because I think it's very important. I think every chapter is important. I liked mostly two. It's the between being and becoming. And I would just want to quote once again your father, because you opened this chapter saying when your father visited in Boston and how he reacted also to what he said and what also he wrote after he came back. One of his columns, because he was a journalist also, and he wrote columns. And you mentioned that once again, it was my father who provided an alternative to my cultural predicament. The idea of belonging need not be place-based. Could you please comment this? Linked to our conversation about art and culture.
Oh my goodness, but thank you for actually picking that up, because one of the things, what he wrote in the column and why he was excited about being in Boston is that he wanted to write something about how Gandhi lives in the world, because he was already very concerned in the 70s that the Gandhian ideas were fading in India. And he said to remind people that where did Gandhi get his idea? He got his idea from Thoreau and Walden Pond. He got his idea from Boston Tea Party, no taxation without representation. The idea of salt march and picking up salt, it came from the United States. At the same time, his first experience was in South Africa. And so Papa was writing about all of this, as well as in Italy, in Sweden, where there were other examples. So he came to Boston when I had just started after finishing my PhD, and I was working at the Boston Museum. And I had just been divorced. So I was trying to figure out who I was, because it felt very lonely on the one hand. And on the other hand, I'm working with art and I'm doing all of this work. And he reminded me that actually belonging and longing can come from all kinds of different places. Gandhi found his inspiration in Boston.
Mm.
You can be in Boston and find your inspiration elsewhere. So the inspiration, aspiration, and belonging can really be in the world. And therefore, it's important for us to recognize, embrace the world, not just the narrow place, because you never know where the inspiration will come from. And that's why I also quote Einstein later on, that imagination is the biggest thing you have going, and open up your world. At the same time, let me just finish it out. You were going to say something, Safwan, which is perfect. But I was just going to say that I think we have to recognize that historical power structures have created problems for us. And so I don't want to minimize that. But Irina, you and I have never really talked about it, but I often think that in all this business of sending objects back or this or that, the truth is that in the global South, people don't have access to other kinds of art.
Mm.
So what if we actually think about exchanges of long-term loans? Nobody in India gets to see Impressionist pictures. Nobody in India gets to see Egyptian sculptures. What if we actually create access to other parts of the world that is not just for the privileged few, which is another way to turn this around. So I just wanted to make sure that we don't forget that the power and history actually sometimes are barriers to us exploring the rest of the world. Sorry, Safwan. Yeah.
No, not at all. Fascinating. I mean, I'm also fascinated by what you were saying earlier about the sense of longing and belonging isn't necessarily tied to a place, and the inspiration can come from everywhere and anywhere. But place also plays a very important role, right? So I wonder, if you don't mind, Irina, maybe we can talk a little bit about the impact on that and on longing and belonging over the past period, right? The past year during the pandemic crisis. You spoke about imagination. And many of us who were stuck in one place for this entire period traveled the world. And our good colleague and friend Carol Becker, Dean of the School of the Arts, wrote a beautiful piece about that, how the imagination allowed you to travel to other places and to bring memories, from places that you've been to in the past. So I wonder if you can comment on that and on what perhaps we have learned also during this past year about empathy, about the familial nature of the world and how that might have changed.
Well, I would say that the pandemic has opened our mind once again to the same very humane feelings, the feelings of solidarity, of empathy, of thinking about the other. And, I think there are two tendencies here. On one side, we saw the world and some governments and others and closing because of the obvious reasons sometimes of fighting the pandemic and protecting their population, their people. But on the other side, in so many communities, we have seen a new expression of compassion, of empathy, of solidarity, which we haven't seen, I would say, in the last years because we were busy after, growing our economies and doing other things. And all of a sudden, we saw that, as Vishakha says, we are one human family because nobody will be safe until everybody is safe. Right. The virus does not know geographical, political borders, religions, political system, ideologies. We are all one human family. And I think probably for the first time, all of a sudden, we were just looking around each one of us and said, but wait a minute, let's just take a break. Let's just see what is happening in our environment, what is happening in the climate, what is happening with my neighbors, with my community, with the others around. And I think this is a very powerful, we saw the young people that are mobilized around ideas. We saw a different mentality. I sincerely hope that this stays. Governments are looking at the health of their people, they're looking at education, they're really looking at those things that are most important. This is about what makes us human and what is human security. This is the most important nowadays that emerges from that point of view. And I'm sure that Vishakha agrees with that.
Well, you know what's so amazing as you were talking, the two things that come to my mind. One is that as I write in the book, in the postscript, that I had almost given up on the title, World as Family, because I was talking to younger people and other colleagues, and they said, it sounds too idealistic and too broad. And even though this is based on a 3,000-year-old Vedic phrase. And I was saying, okay, I think maybe I should just give up on it. Then COVID happens. And I doubled down on it. And actually, I understood for the first time why it was so brilliant. And the prescient idea, and it is through COVID that I got that, right? So it's through Zoom that I kind of understood actually why we needed this. Because I understand now, it is that idea of putting family in relation to world is what was so brilliant about those ancient philosophers. And there are other cultures and other religions have this idea too. But that actually, we all understand what a family is. We know that a family is about you being independent in the context of interdependence. You're part of a unit and you're by yourself. In a functional family, we understand that sometimes you have to give up your selfish interest for the sake of the whole. Sometimes you're mad at somebody, but if you keep holding those grudges, you won't be able to hold on to the family. And I come from a big family of 7 kids, so I know what I'm talking about, right? But if you apply those principles of a familial relationship to the world, what we would recognize that our global family is dysfunctional. We have not understood that independence need not be at the expense of interdependence. It must be seen in relation to one another. And as a result, because we knew this about climate, everybody's been talking about climate crisis, but it's felt abstracted, it was out there. What COVID reminded us is the world lives in our body because the pathogens need not know any borders or nationality. And as a result, it became more urgent and more visceral. And that's when I realized that the brilliance of the phrase was to make you understand the manageable nature of a unit of analysis, if you will, and apply that to the world. But if you don't do that, the risks are big. And yet I have to tell you, both of you, that in the interviews that I've done, when I talk to people who are IR specialists, they actually say, yeah, this is a good idea, but look at all the divisions we have everywhere. How do you explain that? Can we ever get beyond the divisions that we have in our society? And I realized that actually the only way to answer that is to look at the world as glass half full and half empty. Divisions are part of the fear. It's entirely because the world is coming closer and closer together. As we all know about instant communication, which you talked about, Safwan, you have more people on the move than ever before. You have close to 300 million people who live now not born where they were born in, right? In another part of the world. And it's going to change. With climate crisis, you'll have more climate refugees coming. So we better get on with the program that this is the reality. So perhaps people who want to put borders, who want to create the smaller and smaller patch that they can belong to. And I understand that's out of fear of the other, fear of somebody who's different from where you are. And so we have to get at that fear through education. And my hope is with young people, because they understand it. Every single survey that you look at, they're more tolerant of difference. They understand about immigration, and they're passionate about climate. So I personally feel that, and I work with young people, graduate students at Columbia, but also AFS, the other program that I'm part of. So I'm really very excited about the world, and I'm cautiously optimistic because of the young people. So Safwan, you tell me that we have some questions coming in. It's true.
Yeah. Yes, but I loved what you just said, because one way to look at it is as our political leaders, and I put leaders in quotation marks because we really are missing global leadership and have been for a while. As they create more tensions, as they insist on borders closing and on greater isolation, and as we see more polarization around the world, the people to people, the human to human connections become far more important. And I think what you said about this past year, it separated us, and the pandemic separated us, right? We have to be 6 feet apart from one another, at a very micro level. It's also brought us together. So there are so many questions, and some great ones. And so Mudit Jain, whom I presume is in India, is asking about how you deal with the fact that oftentimes the enemies, as he calls them, are closer to you and friends are afar. And you look at that in a geopolitical context, and that's very, very true, right? Your friends are not your neighboring countries, and your neighboring countries are the ones that are competing with you. How do you interpret that in light of the one family, one world concept?
I think that I will come back and just simply say that usually people who are closest to you, it's easier to dislike because you actually have more competition with them to some extent. And therefore, it's also easier to put them in a bucket that actually is not you, on the one hand. On the other hand, it also comes from ignorance of the people who are not like you. And more political leaders actually try to project a particular point of view about those who are closest to you. The more youth, it's also ignorance. Having, not to be too specific, but having traveled in Pakistan extensively and working on exhibitions and cultural things, one of the things I realized is that we were like estranged cousins, that we had so much more in common than we had actually differences. But you wouldn't know that because it's not taught in schools. It is not taught anywhere in both parts of the country, but especially in one particular place. So one way or the other, I do think it comes back to going beyond the ignorance that then plays on your fear. And fear of those who are closest is actually turns into more violent fear. And that, I think, is a problem. So partly, I think that the questioner is right. Sometimes it's easier for us to say, I can connect to the world if you make the world over there, not in your own place. And so I feel very sad that this Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the phrase on the basis of which I've used the title, actually is in the front of the Parliament of India. This is the aspiration. And the political leaders talk about it as part of their foreign policy. It's easier to do that than to do the hard work of treating your neighbor as your family, treating the people who are different in your diverse background, as is true in the United States. Here is a country that's made up of so many different kinds of people. Each immigrant comes sometimes, and people come from elsewhere by force or by choice. They learn how to be American, but in the process, they also change what it means to be American aspirationally. We get stuck because actually people say, no, you're not American enough. Look at the Asian hate crimes, or even the Black Lives Matter. Who is more properly American? Not to recognize that diversity is what makes America what it is. And that is true in India too. It's the diversity that makes what India what it is, not small groups of people. So we have to fight harder to educate, to get rid of the fear and know people in their individual stories. So I've often said that global is really telling one story at a time, one way of looking at cultural differences, and recognize that differences is what makes us human.
Right. So, I mean, yes, differences do make us human. And I'm glad that you brought out bigotry. You know, we see it now in anti-Asian bigotry, Black Lives Matter, of course, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, those kinds of things. And, you know, you look at leadership, right? I mean, so former US President Donald Trump stoked those differences and those sentiments and so on. He didn't create them, but he certainly allowed them, he cultivated them and deliberately sought divisiveness and enmity. So education is one way that we deal with this. And this is a question for both of you, Irina. I mean, you know, given your work, what are other useful tools to deal with this? And it's not only about who defines who's an American, but, you know, what defines us as global citizens.
You know, I think Vishakha mentioned just a while ago that education is important. And I do believe that cultural literacy, I would say, is important. It is sometimes defining what kind of a history young kids are given in school. I'm confident that nobody is born a racist or an extremist or anti-Semite, anti-Islamic believer or somebody. They are few, they are made afterwards. And what they are taught in school from the very young age, I believe, is critical. And this is where United Nations, and when we were working on the Sustainable Development Goals, we launched the concept of education for global citizenship, where intercultural literacy takes a very prominent role. It is about knowledge the other. It is about sharing. Sometimes we forget that the word nowadays should be indeed about sharing. And this reminds me, when Vishakha was speaking, it reminds me of what a famous Nigerian writer, who unfortunately passed away, Chinua Achebe, wrote once, a very favorite quote of mine, who said, "You have to take from the other something to make you a whole." And this kind of a feeling, if it is instilled in all of us, as Vishakha says, a human family, maybe we will make a more tolerant world.
Yeah, you know, I did one of the podcasts was a parenting podcast, and they asked me, what can parents do to actually get their kids to think about global belonging or a global citizenship? And one of the things that I learned from my younger relatives and what they're doing, and that is that with their kids, they really work on getting them to read about stories that are not like them, to actually see a film that is from somewhere else, to actually understand that there are different people learning, behaving differently, working differently. And that gets to one of the questions about cultural appropriation, which right now is such a big deal. And I always use the example of that young woman in Utah who wore cheongsam, the Chinese dress, to her graduation. And other Asian American kids said, "How dare you wear our clothes?" But guess what? In Hong Kong, in Taiwan, and in China, people were so happy. Said, "Oh, how nice. Somebody's wearing our clothes. That's terrific." So we need to actually use this notion of cultural appropriation much more reflectively, and recognize that sometimes curiosity is one of the best ways you learn about something. My life changed because I was an exchange student. Christine Lagarde, one thing that she told me the first time we met, because we both learned that we were AFS students, and we always say change our lives. Jan Eliasson, the head who used to be the president of the General Assembly, AFS student. One of the things that we recognize with the exchange program is that you have to put yourself into somebody else's shoe. Think about how to actually see the world from somebody else's point of view. And when you're younger, the better. And that way, you actually recognize that they're human beings and they think very differently from you. Now, not everybody has the advantage or the opportunity to be an exchange student. 16 years old, more than 55 years ago, I come to this country and it changed my life, right? Yeah. But what we're starting now, which is what Irina is talking about, and I think that online tools exist. So at AFS also, where I chair the board, we're developing a whole new program that's all online. Yeah. Stephen's initiative, UN, and we're working with UNESCO, we're working with OECD. I think more people are recognizing that these tools are necessary and we have to provide these tools. Universities are a perfect place only if we actually use it. Right. Not put them into little category that they stay over here and somebody else stays over there. Yeah. We have to work hard to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I wish we had another hour just to talk about cultural appropriation, and as somebody else is asking about preserving ethnic and indigenous cultures, right? So that you celebrate a global culture, but you don't homogenize it and you preserve the indigenous. And of course, sometimes it gets very political and we will need many, many hours to talk about the one thing that I am particularly sensitive to, which is the appropriation of Palestinian culture, Palestinian cuisine, for example, by Israel. So, you know, there are different sort of dimensions to all of this. I don't know if you want to just say something very quickly about that, and then we'll move to other questions.
Right.
Yeah, please, Vishakha. Please, Vishakha.
You know, I was just going to say that I think one of the things about the cultural appropriation is at least ask people, don't claim, don't take it away. The first thing is at least see and give credit where credit is due. But the big thing is at least ask people, how do you feel if I wear this? You know, it's called consent, right? I mean, so there are some things that you have to do, and that's where the power structure comes in. You know, mango chutney, the way you get it from General Gray's chutney, has nothing to do with India. It's actually British invention. And at the same time, I said, okay, if that works, just don't call it Indian. Say you learned that from India, but it's not Indian.
Yeah. Irina?
Just one remark. I think it's important because Vishakha spoke about power structures. I think the fact that there is so much political considerations, so sometimes we see this behind all the discussion about identity and culture and preservation, testifies to its importance. I think it is highly important nowadays in the world. And the fact that politicians sometimes are taking over, I would say, this debate is precisely because it matters, and it matters enormously for the people. And my second remark, very brief, is that we're really talking about cultural appropriation, or what you mentioned about the preservation. We really need to be more sensitive. We really need to understand its importance and try to make it work for the communities, for more than people. You mentioned Palestine or any other similar community and circumstance. I think this is important. Vishakha said that ask them what they want. And I think this is critical, not just take big political decisions without involving the communities and the people that are involved in this.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Irina. And thank you, Vishakha. So Vivek Chamria congratulates you, Vishakha, on the lovely book. And I think, you know, she asked some questions that I think we've dealt with in terms of justice and in terms of bigotry and so on. But she's asking, I think it's a she, I'm not sure, so forgive me.
He, Vivek is a he.
Vivek is a he, I'm sorry, okay. Asking as a parent, okay, And you talked about this earlier, and you talked about the program that you did with parents about guiding them, guiding, parents guiding their children on the idea of belonging. But I want to connect this with a question that I had in my reserve, because I know that your research inspiration comes from your work with students and young people. And we've done some programming together with the global centers, right? The Youth in a Changing World program, for example. So can we go back to that theme and talk specifically, to bring it back to the book, how your engagement with youth, how your engagement also with parents of youth maybe has shaped the book and informed your overall thinking and work?
Well, let me first say that I think that in fact, the book is inspired by them, and I call them my global Sherpas, in the sense that when I had this thought of the banyan tree as my kind of metaphor for the world, and I realized that I had the luxury of a lifetime to learn about these layers and add them to my existence. And they come in and they are global natives. The world is in the palm of their hand on their cell phone. And this next generation, Generation Z, they don't know any other world but that world. And you can say, yes, it doesn't have access, but the truth is 50% of the world young people today have access to smartphone. So that's a huge number of people. And at the same time, there is this anxiety of, can you actually belong to one place and be part of the world? And it's actually because of those questions that I've had with them, with my students, with younger people, that I thought, I need to figure out, how did I become so passionate? How did I add these layers? What is it? So in a way, this book is an answer to those questions. And I also feel that the young people, Youth in a Changing World is a perfect example. We were doing all these workshops in individual locations, Rio, Istanbul, Amman, Tunis, you name it. And we were doing this work through global centers and our colleagues. When COVID happened, these were the students who said, we want to do something across. We want to know what other people are doing. And we did one of the early kind of conversations a year ago in April, because of COVID, to just say, how is COVID affecting you? And the kids in Istanbul wanted to know what kids in Nairobi were thinking. They actually said to us, we don't want to know so much about America. We want to know what's happening in other parts of the world. And that told me that they are much more open and they want to know what's going on in other parts of the world. And that also says something to me. And that is that I'm not making young people as a panacea. I realize that there are a whole lot of other issues too. But if anything, they are more ready than when I was their age, because I didn't know any better. I mean, to come to America as an exchange student, and it took me 3 days to even book a call to talk to my parents in India because I had broken my leg. That was the only reason I could call them. So the point being is that they're more ready, they're more aware, there's still a lot of work to do, and they feel that the systems have not caught up with the world that they are inheriting. And I think they're right, because the systems are still post-World War II systems.
Right.
And 50 years, 60 years, 70 years is a long time.
Yeah.
And so we have to recognize that the world we're leaving behind as people of one generation is not quite ready for prime time for them.
Yeah. But do you think that they have the opportunity? Do you think that they have the means? And how can we help them take charge? How can we help them sort of create those systems that serve them? I mean, we see it happening in the area of climate. They're taking charge. They're taking charge, right? And we have to.
They are saying, I think that surveys show us actually that kids are ready, but they really feel they don't know how to engage. The systems are not ready for them. So the first thing is to change the systems. So
enlightened people can help show them the way.
Yeah, and change the systems. I mean, Irina would know this, working with younger people too.
Yeah.
No, I think it's critical what you said also about the universities. We are seeing universities taking the lead, actually playing a much, much bigger role in all this debate about sustainability, about climate, about and multiplying the exchange programs also online. I think now the digital, because there is a lot of debate about the digital. And I think it is very important to make the digital working exactly for this purpose. It's tremendous opportunity. Of course, I know that it cannot solve all the problems because we know that in schools, in education, or in universities, these are also venues of pedagogical approach. It's a venues of working together. It's of teamwork of others. But the digital creates a hugely important space for that. And if we don't put it to work for that, I think we will miss a big opportunity.
Thank you, Irina. So we're coming up against time, and I'm going to end with a couple of comments that are very, very endearing and dear. So Howard Spodek writes, "Dear Vishakha, great to see you and to reminisce about my days visiting your family in Ahmedabad in 1964 to 1966 and learning so much from all of you. I hope that Gandhi does not become only a Bostonian. He taught the world about the power of sitting Dharma, a strategy he learned from growing up in Saurashtra. Also, culture is not only dance and art, it is also how we say hello and goodbye to people. And I've observed you, Vishakha, in meetings and in further dialogues and interactions, and you bring your dance and you bring your art into it, and it really is wonderful. It's how we offer food to guests, Howard continues to say, and it's also how we do or do not look people in the eye, something we really missed over Zoom.
Right.
And made us, if you remember the first few weeks of Zoom, we all felt incredibly exhausted very, very quickly. And then, you understand that psychological, because we're looking for those cues, right, that come with facial expressions and with the eyes. And then, before I turn it over to the two of you for any closing remarks, an attendee has said, what an exquisite conversation between three dear friends. I feel privileged to be in your warm, encouraging presence. That's very beautiful. So thank you. And I could not say it any better. This has really been phenomenal. And I myself feel privileged to be in the presence of the two of you. And thank you for a really enlightening and I think absolutely encouraging and hopeful set of thoughts. So with great thanks to you, I'll turn it over to you if you want to say anything in closing. Vishakha?
Maybe I say Vishakha closes. Could I just say that Vishakha closes? I think she really wrote a wonderful book. I just want to say thank you, Vishakha, that you did not give up. Because as you said, there was a moment when you were thinking that maybe it's too idealistic, but I really would like to thank you for that. We need this type of idealism. We need ideas. We need this moral, intellectual solidarity of humanity. I'm coming back to UNESCO's constitution. And I think you wonderfully represent exactly this moral and intellectual solidarity of humanity. Even now, after COVID, we need more books like yours, more ideas like yours. And I hope that your book will become a venue of more debates, will encourage more young people of thinking about what it means to be human nowadays in a globalized, interconnected world where we all depend to each other and we all need to respect each other. So thank you, Vishakha, that you did not give up.
Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure and what a great honor it is, really. The purpose of the book was just to be a catalyst for conversation that would open up debates and discussions. And I really do think, and Howard, thank you, Howard, for writing that note. Somebody who has known me ever since I was 16, 17 years old, which is amazing. But the truth is that we really think about how you take something from one place and it goes elsewhere. And I want to end with actually a movie that I would recommend to all of you. It's called Ahimsa, which is Gandhian principle and how it manifests itself in other parts of the world, all the way from Martin Luther King to Nelson Mandela to Walensky and to Eastern Europe. That notion of moral clarity in which you actually recognize what it means to be human and to respect others as human beings, to see them as human first, and then recognize the specificity. And so I feel that the book is one person's journey to get there, but it represents millions of others, people like all of you who actually can think about coming together, because you know what? We need it. The forces on the other side are pretty strong. So I hope that it really encourages all of us to come together and celebrate who we are as human beings. Thank you, Safwan.
Thank you. Get the book.
Great.
It is a really, really fantastic read. And I think we put in the chat how you may order it from Columbia University Press and get a discount. So tell your friends about it. And Vishakha, thank you for writing it. Vishakha and Irina, thank you for being the people that you are. And thank you for sharing so much of yourselves. Thank you to our audience for sticking with us, and goodbye.
And read the book.
And read
Thank you.